What were the intolerable acts, and how did they lead to the start of the American Revolution? What induced New Englanders to openly resist British policies? For answers to these questions and more Army History Insights, stay tuned.
Welcome to the U.S. Army History and Heritage Podcast, the official podcast of the United States Army Center of Military History. The Center of Military History writes and publishes the Army's official history, manages the U.S. Army Museum Enterprise, and provides historical support throughout the U.S. Army.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the United States Army History and Heritage Podcast. I'm Lee Reynolds, the Strategic Communications Officer for the Center of Military History. In this episode, we're discussing the New England Revolt and the final events that directly led to the start of the American Revolution. Joining me for this discussion is Army historian Joseph Seymour. Welcome, Joe.
Hi, Lee. It's great to be here.
Thanks. Thanks for coming back. We had a great discussion all about the militias, the history of the militia leading up to the Revolutionary War. So we're going to go a little bit more into detail on some of the things that led directly to that. But before we do, let me just remind people who you are. So Joe Seymour was born and raised in the Philadelphia area. He attended Lewis and Clark College, the Pennsylvania State University, the University of Edinburgh, and Temple University, earning a bachelor's and a master's degree in history. While in Scotland, he served as an intern at the home headquarters of the Royal Scots Dragoon Guards. He inventoried the regimental manuscript collection and learned about the British Army's regimental system. He also served in Troop A, 1st Squadron, 104th Cavalry Regiment of the Pennsylvania Army National Guard, and he has worked as an Army historian since 2004. His primary professional focus is on organizational history, the history and culture of the American soldier in the 18th century, and the evolution of small arms and tactics during that era. Well, Joe, thanks again so much for being here. You definitely the subject matter expert we're looking for on these topics. So the build-up to the American involvement in the Revolutionary War, a lot of things going on throughout the colonies, but specifically in New England we're going to focus on here, really calling it the crisis in New England. So first, describe what was New England's relationship with the British Empire prior to the 1760s.
Well, absolutely. The New Englanders generally considered themselves as proud members of the British Empire. They considered themselves British Americans and were very proud of the traditions of the British, the Magna Carta, right, the British constitutional law, loyalty to the king.
To the king, to Parliament.
Loyalty
right.
to the king and to Parliament. That was something that was ingrained. While they considered themselves unique and exceptional, I don't think that they would have been too different from British English-speaking people anywhere else. Right. Of course we're different. Of course we're special.
Were there any differences in how they viewed themselves as opposed to other British colonists?
Oh, yeah. New Englanders were distinct. If you had to describe one part of the British colonies as being particularly well-developed and distinct, it would be New England. New Englanders, of course, had been founded by the Puritans. There were more than just Puritans in New England. There was a fairly diverse community. But that said, they were far more homogeneous, say, than colonies such as Pennsylvania or New York, which had different ethnic groups and even different people speaking different languages, as right. New York did with Dutch and Pennsylvania and German. So New Englanders were far more homogeneous, also tended to be more densely concentrated into towns, looked to the sea. New England sort of sticks out to the east of the sea, and were a bit more distinct, say, than right. other colonies.
Yeah, so 1755 to 1763, we have the French and Indian War. I think globally it was also known as the 7 Years' War. And they fought in that war. Everything seemed good.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, at the end of the war, New Englanders felt throughout the war they contributed soldiers, not only to their northern and western frontier, but also sailors to the cause. They welcomed redcoats among them. They they were leaders in the fight against Bourbon France and Spain.
And in that war, did they fight as militia or did they fight as redcoats, or were they two separate things?
Well, yeah, I mean, it was one of the big prizes that a colonist could get would be a commission in the British Army or in the Royal Navy, and it was generally closed to people that didn't have status.
Okay.
You had to purchase a commission, and generally it was done through some sort of preferment. You had to know somebody, you had to come from the right family. New Englanders didn't have that, so most served as provincials, or they served in the militia. And that idea of privilege and title was something that several Americans coveted.
Oh, yeah.
So that was a really important thing, because with it came status and wealth, and also permanency for your family. So that meant your children could then enjoy status and wealth.
Who are some of the American colonists, not necessarily in New England, that purchased commissions and were considered redcoats?
Oh gosh, well, one would be James Bradstreet, who was the son of a British soldier, but he led the expedition against Fort Frontenac in 1756 on Lake Oswego in western New York. They were fewer and far between Americans who actually got commissions. Off the top of my head, I can't think of anyone who was able to do that. George Washington coveted a commission.
Right.
There was an American Philadelphia revolutionary leader, Benjamin Loxley, who almost got a commission in 1758 from General John Forbes as an artillery officer, but he was kept from it by another leading American, Benjamin Franklin. That's a whole nother side story. Because of that, we got a revolutionary and not another artillery officer. So it did occur, but
for the most part, they fought as what? Just
provincials
provincials
or militia.
Okay.
And within their colonies were very highly regarded. To be a provincial officer, it meant something. Provincials were full-time soldiers who wore uniforms, who were expected to comport themselves as officers, as were members of the militia. But it was a status between the militia and being a regular.
So through the end of that war, the French and Indian War, we're now in the mid-1760s. And I know we did touch on this topic in our previous podcast, but we want to go a little bit more into detail on what changed. And I think it was was it the Intolerable Acts?
Well, I think we want to go
taxes first.
Yeah, I think it's the taxes.
Taxes first.
It's the bills that Britain has to pay in 1763. And as I said, they were financial and also political. One of the political bills that the British have to pay is are the alliances with the various Indian nations that had allied themselves with the British at a critical point in the war. So you had very, very powerful, and one of the most powerful nations, the Six Nations in New York.
Iroquois?
The Iroquois, the Six Haudenosaunee, the Mohawk, the Oneida, Cayuga, Onondaga, Seneca, Tuscarora. I think I got all six. They were at the Treaty of Easton in 1758. They had been previously neutral for 58 years.
Oh, wow.
Ever since the Treaty of Montreal in 1701, they now swung in on the side. They went from being simply benignly neutral to now we are going to swing for King George II, and this was a game changer. But they had to be respected and paid back. And so Britain establishes the proclamation line, and that limits colonial settlement west of the Alleghenies or Appalachians.
Right.
The mountains have different names elsewhere. And so
Americans. So that upset the Americans.
Yeah,
right?
that's upsetting the Americans. Yeah. That's saying, wait a minute, now we're secondary. And
we just fought this war, and now you're limiting our expansion.
Right. By golly, we want to expand. So there's this, and it's also, it's the imposition of taxes. Wait a minute. Mm-hmm. We were full, the Americans saw themselves as full partners in the empire. Mm-hmm. And the British ruling class said, no, you don't have title. You don't have privilege. You don't, because you don't have title, you don't have privilege. And because you don't have privilege, you don't have power. Right. And so we can tax you as we want. And you need to be taxed.
Even though they're already being taxed by the local governments here. But they'd never been taxed by Parliament before this.
No, that was the taxes were, you'd have import duties. The tax that really galvanized colonists early on was the stamp tax, 1765.
And explain that.
Yeah. The stamp tax placed a duty on all paper goods. Now, think about that. That means if you want to send a letter, the paper you're writing on is taxed.
So not just the cost of sending the letter, it's the paper itself.
It's the paper itself.
It's stamped, right?
And it's stamped.
That's how they call it the Stamp Act.
Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And you also, so if you buy a newspaper, it's taxed. If you want to get together with your friends and play cards, the cards are taxed. Wow. So it's everywhere you go. And of course, for people who read books, and there was a high literacy rate in America, the highest literacy rate of any region in America was New England. Oh, okay. New Englanders going back to the 1600s, Massachusetts had passed laws requiring a primary education. Oh, wow. So New Englanders were literate. Long, cold nights, and you're living under the Congregationalists, so you don't go out dancing, you sit home and read. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but the idea is that New Englanders were even more literate. So the idea of the written word being as a means to communicate, and then as you're reading a pamphlet, it's got this stamp tax, this tax stamp on it. Yeah. So it's this very, very visible form of an arbitrary tax. We did not vote on these taxes. This is taxation without representation.
Right. And so how is that affecting the colonists? I mean, what is it doing to their daily lives?
It leads to, it's the another thing to note about taxes is that the colonies are cash poor. Oh, okay. Many colonies do print their own currency, but it is not backed by specie, or it is backed by limited specie. Now, without getting into finance and economics, a Massachusetts pound note was not worth a pound sterling. Okay. And very little in terms of specie, that is coinage, made it over to the colonies. So for Americans to be paying extra for something that, oh, by the way, we weren't allowed to produce paper. It was basically something that we were forced to buy anyway, and now forced to pay a tax on. It wasn't something that, okay, well, America, you're the leading paper producer, so you pay a tax on something that you produce anyway, so that's going back to your paper mill is going to make the money.
With all the trees in the colonies, where did their paper come from?
England. So okay. Wow. If you're lumber was a big deal. Okay. Was a big export in this country. So
I don't want to get off topic, sorry, but yeah.
But to stay on very, very briefly, so we produced raw materials, let's lumber as one of them, sent them to England where they're made into finished products and sold back to us.
Okay.
And then we have to pay a tax on them.
Yeah.
Same thing with a lot of other things. Iron, glass, our iron from Pennsylvania and New Jersey goes to England, comes back in the form of finished iron goods. So this is what gets Americans really, really worked up. And there are riots over the Stamp Act. Stamp collectors are getting beaten up.
Oh.
Yeah. And anybody who was seen as friends with the stamp collectors was getting in trouble.
Oh, wow.
So,
And so there was unrest. How was this resolved?
Well, the British repealed the Stamp Act. But they kept these they're called the Townsend duties.
Okay.
And they maintained these other duties basically on finished products. And as each duty is eventually repealed, it leads to, while the British are seen as saying, okay, we're appeasing the Americans, this is causing, we can't afford to send troops over there to enforce these laws, so let's just find a way to make the money the other way. And that's what they do, is they just eventually, we're going to repeal these taxes, but we'll keep one tax in place. And they do it with a very sort of one of these things. They said, okay, well, we'll have the tax on tea.
Yeah.
But we're also going to reserve the right to tax you.
Oh, okay. So we're going to untax you for now, except for tea.
Except for tea.
But who knows what could happen in the future.
But we can tax you anytime we want.
We reserve that right.
So it's a very intellectualized rebellion. It's not a rebellion yet.
And was that a signal to the colonists to behave or else?
Oh, well, that was the intended signal, but of course the colonists said, no, we're not going to. We are in the right here.
Right.
This is. And
they demonstrated their frustration, and we talked about this more in depth, I think, in the last episode, but with the Boston Tea Party.
Yeah. I mean, that is the culmination of all of these revolts going back to 1765. I mean, so we forget about the Glass Act, but all of these different duties that had been imposed. So yeah.
And then we now start seeing the intolerable acts.
Yes.
So how did they come about, and what exactly were they?
Yeah. Well, this is part and parcel with the with the various duties. So the night of December 1773, Sons of Liberty board 3 ships in Boston Harbor. They destroy the tea. There are various other demonstrations in other colonies. Annapolis, Greenwich, New Jersey, in South Jersey, has a burning of tea in 1774. But it's really Boston that the North Ministry is identifying as the epicenter of this vile resistance, these unruly Americans. And we are going to abolish the Massachusetts government, the Massachusetts Government Act. We are going to dissolve their charter, their sacred colonial charter. If you are familiar with the portrait of Samuel Adams by John Singleton Copley, he has his finger on the Massachusetts charter. He's pointing to the charter, the law. So he is. So this idea is something that is sacred as the Massachusetts charter is now being abolished. The Massachusetts Port Act. We're going to close the port of Boston. No ships may leave or enter except Royal Navy vessels, and including Royal Navy transports. And we are now going to quarter soldiers, the Quartering Act. We're going to send regiments, British Army regiments, and a battalion of Marines to Boston. So we are closing the port of Boston. We're dissolving the Massachusetts government. We're placing a military governor in charge of Massachusetts by the name of Thomas Gage, Major General Thomas Gage. We are going to send troops to enforce these acts until the tea is paid. And by closing the port of Boston, we're also closing off all your commerce, so you don't have a way to pay
Right. So is this a state of emergency or martial law?
This
I
is
guess you could
martial
call
law.
it. Yeah.
And there's you also have now that there are going to be no courts held in Boston.
Oh.
If you commit a crime, the crime is now going to be adjudicated in London.
So what does that do to any of the militia that was in Boston or even the Sons of Liberty?
Well, one of the things it does is it shuts down all commerce in Boston. Oh, it shuts down all commerce in Boston. So if you and I were good Bostonians and we worked, you were a sailor and I'm a stevedore, I unload the ships, and we've got nothing to do except drill.
All right. But could you do it in Boston or under the nose of the British Army?
You couldn't. In fact, one of the Boston Corps of Cadets, which was a volunteer militia organization that John Hancock belonged to, turned in its colors.
Oh.
They had royal colors, Union Jack and all that, and they turned them in. And many Bostonians exfiltrated out to the countryside where there was a provisional government and where they could drill and did drill. And so you have inside Boston, people are living under martial law. Now, was it terribly, horribly oppressive? No, not necessarily. Thomas Gage had lived in North America for many, many years. He was married to Margaret Kemble. Margaret Kemble Gage was an American from a prominent New York family. So you could say he liked Americans. He didn't think that this drift toward war was a good idea. He was asked how long it would take to subdue the Americans. He said 10 years, if you're lucky.
And why 10 years?
Because he had been across this continent. He had been with, he had fought in the French and Indian War. He knew Americans. He knew how big this place was. Many people in Europe didn't have a concept. And he knew how many Americans had military experience. So he said, no, this is going to take forever.
He understood the militia system.
He understood the militia system. He understood how many New Englanders were under arms and how committed, how serious Americans were about this concept of taxation without representation.
And let's talk about that for a moment, how many Americans were under arms. Well, first of all, how many British were there in Boston?
Not many. I mean, I think
a few thousand.
You're talking about a few thousand, and then you've got in the Massachusetts countryside, probably in excess of 30,000
militia.
Yeah,
opposing them.
Yeah. All told,
Wow.
So,
and that's just in Massachusetts.
And that's just Massachusetts.
Okay.
So it's the numbers are telling now.
And Gage understood that.
Gage understood that. Yeah. Okay. So he understands that regardless of the actual numbers that we're talking about, the disproportionate nature was immense. And of course, while the British had control of the Seaway and the British had control of Boston, Boston at the time was almost an island. There was one road in, one road out over Boston Neck. You could get to Boston by water, through nearby towns, but that meant that the lines of communication across the land were owned by the Sons of Liberty.
Okay.
So the British were sort of penned up in Boston. Many of their soldiers had only been in service for a short period of time compared to many Americans who were led by veterans who had served in the militia since they had been 16 or 18. Right. So while they were professional soldiers, their level of combat experience varied significantly, and they're in the city. Many of them arrive in 1774, and they're here for only a matter of months. So there's a sea voyage in those days could take a lot out of even a very healthy person. So the idea was that they needed exercises. It was hard for them to do the long marches that is so essential to military readiness. Right. While they did practice firing at marks off the wharves in Boston Harbor, that was also an issue. So there are a lot of logistical constraints here.
So by the fall of 1774, you now have provincial government outside of Boston. And where were they based?
Concord.
In Concord. Okay.
Yeah, in Concord.
Yeah, and the militias there in New England were preparing.
Yeah, they had stepped up regular drilling. They had been stockpiling arms. They had somewhere in the neighborhood of 11,000 bayonets in storage. Now, whether those were getting out to the companies of militia is sort of a, let's just say, that's debatable. But the point is they had, on paper, they had, and that's one for every 3 soldiers or so. They were stockpiling artillery. There was in 1774. There was an expedition, New Hampshire expedition, to take Fort William and Mary, which was the fort defending Portsmouth, and it very nearly resulted in bloodshed. Then there's also the Salem powder alarm. So, well, I'm jumping ahead of myself a little bit, but you've got stepped up military preparedness
By the militia.
And Gage is trying to get his army seasoned, as they say. Get them, get the soldiers, get them physically fit, get them, drilling them, getting them used to carrying their muskets. But they're in a very crowded city. They're in a very small setting. So he gets this idea of seasoning marches. We're gonna send them on road marches out into the countryside. And the idea is it's a show of force, but it's also a way to get his soldiers in shape. Meanwhile, the militia doesn't have that problem. Many of these soldiers are agricultural. They they work outside anyway, and they're also drilling regularly. And of course that's exercising different muscles, as we both know.
Exactly. And so Gage senses all this. He understands that the militia is building up, is preparing. And all these shadow governments, you call them a provincial government, and now there's a Continental Congress that exists. So the signs of resistance or war are evident.
Yes, we have a government.
Yeah.
In 1774, the colonies get together. Not all of them. But they get together and they say, we're going to have let's call it a Congress. I mean, this is new. Okay, there had been an Albany Congress in 1774, but we're going to have a Congress, a lowercase c. And we're going to be a Congress, a Continental Congress. And this idea of we're all going to get together and figure out what it is we're going to do.
Right.
And that Congress, that's in the fall of 74. That adjourns, but Americans are preparing. There's a sense of, hey, we better start to, and you start to see throughout the colonies, you're starting to see militia reorganizing and new organizations organizing. My own National Guard unit organized in 1774, November 17th, 1774. So just as the Continental Congress is adjourning, 28 Philadelphians said, hey, let's organize a troop of light horse. Well, a few weeks later in Baltimore, there's a corps of cadets that forms under Mordecai Gist and others. That's in December of 1774. And so they're now the 1st Battalion, 175th Infantry Regiment. Meanwhile, existing militia, like the Middlesex Militia, which is now perpetuated by the 1st Battalion, 182nd Infantry, Massachusetts Army National Guard, these existing and new organizations are starting to take shape around the country, and they're with us to this day.
Now, getting into 1775, Gage, sitting in Boston, he knows the militia is building up, and I think he's directed from I don't know if it was by Parliament or the King to take some type of action.
Yeah.
You mentioned the Salem March, but talk a little bit more about these types of things that he was doing and what the purpose was.
Yes, yeah. So he's got these seasoning marches going out into the countryside, and this is to train his soldiers, physically fit, physical training, and tactical, of course. But he's also, the Salem powder alarm was just that. The Sons of Liberty, the committees of safety are organizing. Our revolutionaries, our provisional government organizes committees of safety. The idea is it's not how to safely use things; it's public safety. So security. They organize a system, a complex system of alarms, but they're not quite in place. So there's a raid against a powder stockpile, powder cache in Salem, Massachusetts, that Gage is able to get to before the Sons of Liberty and the Committee of Safety can secure it. In early 1775, Gage gets a letter which basically states that he's going to be replaced, and that he needs to nip this resistance in the bud.
Right.
And there are some yes men who are being sent to get the job done. Gage is saying, no, really, you don't know. But Gage is a good soldier and an able administrator and a good soldier. And so he organizes a raid. Now the provincial government is meeting out there, and the three troublemakers, John Adams, John Hancock, and Samuel Adams, who's a cousin of John Adams, are out there. And there's a large stockpile of arms and munitions in Concord. So Gage plans an elaborate expedition for the 18th of April. It had been a very warm winter. That's important for those of us with a military background. It meant that there had been very little snow and ice. It meant that the roads were in good condition to march on. They weren't overly muddy. And he is going to take a task force of selected soldiers.
Right.
He's going to take his light companies. Every British regiment had a company of light infantry, and also a company of specialized elite shock troops, grenadiers. And I'm going to take all of the light companies from the regular regiments that I have, as well as from the battalion of Marines, and I'm going to put them into a specialized task force, about 600 or 700 soldiers, and I'm going to send them out there under Colonel Smith.
Okay, yeah.
And it's going to be a nighttime raid. I'm going to there's a Marine major by the name of Major Pitcairn, who I'm going to send. He's popular with the Americans. He's well liked, and so the idea is he can be sort of a public affairs guy, or some sort of more of a negotiator. If he's there, maybe he can diffuse things.
I can recognize associate with that.
He's he's a young, hard charging, aggressive guy, whereas Smith's old, middle aged, but he's also a lieutenant colonel who's got the rank.
But the point, I think, of all this is they weren't intending for combat at all.
I'm going to go out. I'm going to arrest these leaders, and we're going to destroy the arms, and then get back into Boston before they know what hit them. And then that's a show of force.
Right. You talked about the system of alarms. Now, Gage must have known that they had this. He had intelligence. Talk about what those systems of alarms were, and what did Gage do to counter those?
It's a good question. The Sons of Liberty were very active in Boston. They were everywhere. One of the biggest leaders, the tradesmen throughout the colonies, but we'll just limit it to Boston for now. Tradesmen were very well educated, very prosperous, and very, very well connected, not only among their own trade guilds, but with each other. One of the a perfect example of one of these middling tradesman was Paul Revere, the silversmith. So this network of spies was all over the city. They had developed a very elaborate system. They could even they even had members within the clergy.
Oh, yeah.
So a clergyman could give a coded sermon.
Oh, okay.
That's apparently what touched off the Boston Tea Party was a sermon.
Oh, wow.
Where if he said one thing, it meant one thing, and if he said another thing, it meant another thing. And of course, at Old North Church, there was a system of signals. Everybody knows the story,
right?
The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere.
One if by land, two if by sea.
And so the society, so they.
Well, you talked about that land bridge, right?
Yeah.
So Boston is at the time almost being like an island with one land bridge. So that's what he meant by land.
Yeah.
Are the British going to come out that way, or are they going to take a boat, or
are they going to take ships or take launches? And now it's exactly what that meant. So if by land, it would be over the neck into Cambridge, and then by sea, no, that's not Cambridge. By sea, they would take it over to Lechmere Point, which is near the base of Breed's Hill, into Charlestown, and then march by the road to by the what they call the Menotomy Road. Menotomy being a small town, and so the idea is all of these things took time,
right?
And so and getting back to our system of signals, if you could easily see a signal beacon from Boston, you could easily see if you were a watcher in Charlestown, which Charlestown being very hilly, you could easily see that signal beacon, and you were there to watch it, and you knew what to look for. You would then light a signal beacon, and you could also, there were systems of riders who were ready. They had horses ready to go.
The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere.
The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere and William Dawes and others. Right. So the idea is riders could get out, spread the alarm. Signal guns would fire, cannons that would, we just heard the signal cannon. So it wasn't, we think of the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, right? He's riding through the countryside with his cuptan. The British were coming, and it's more like, stop at this tavern.
Okay, yeah.
Who's the captain of the militia? They didn't even have to say that. He said, "Yeah, I need Captain Smith. I need Captain Parker. Hey, how's it going?
Not well.
Not
British
well
are
if I'm here." Right? He's like, right. So they know it's like if you woke me up in the middle of the night, and so this can spread very, very rapidly, faster than somebody could ride.
And church bells, I think, too, right?
Church bells.
Yeah, they had certain signals.
And that's what church bells were there for. So the idea is you could, by sound and by beacon and also by human word of mouth, you could quickly get out through the countryside, miles and miles into the countryside.
And the purpose of that was to mobilize the militia.
Yes. And then they in turn, so they had what we would call now what we would now call like a telephone chain.
Right. Yeah.
So they could,
And I know we touched on this in a previous episode, but it's not just the militia, but we also have the Minutemen now, too.
Yes.
That were formed. Talk about why the Minutemen were formed.
Yeah, the Minutemen were, this was a system that goes back to the 17th century. The idea was that simply calling part-time soldiers out for contingencies was not necessarily the best use of labor. The idea was that if you had younger men under the age of 35 who were going to be the most fit, but also the least encumbered by children, marriage, occupational pursuits, people who could spend a few weeks out in the field. So the idea is, and who could also afford, a few extra hours of drill. And these were soldiers that were fully equipped, armed with, armed with good muskets or fowling pieces. Those are sporting arms. Think of shotguns. They could perform the drill. They could turn out quickly.
Right.
Thus
what we call today,
Minutemen.
Yeah, quick reaction force.
Quick reaction force. Yeah. And so
that first line of defense.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
But but like any militia or National Guard, they lived at home, so they still had to be contacted. But the committees of safety and the minute companies had, they knew where to find people, and of course your meeting house bell starts to ring in the middle of the night. You knew it was either a fire or an invasion. Yeah. And so they knew that as they put it, the regulars are turning out, and they knew that this was going to happen. Yeah.
This kind of brings us up to that April 18th. Yes. Just before Gage sends his troops out, and Paul Revere and others raise the alarm in the countryside. But by this point, how was the rest of the country viewing what was happening there? What was their opinion of what was happening in New England?
There was a growing concern. As I said, the First Continental Congress had convened and adjourned. There were heightened preparations throughout the colonies. I wouldn't say it was generalized. There were people who were still very loyal. I mean, there hadn't actually been bloodshed. Okay, all of this is far away from me. People felt, but there was let's just say a sizable minority, if not, you could argue that a majority among certain people that said, this is something that can affect us all. There was not one Boston Tea Party. There was one Boston Tea Party, but there was an Annapolis tea burning. There was in Greenwich, New Jersey, there had been a tea burning, and elsewhere. Off the top of my head, those two always stand out.
Well, what actions were Congress taking? Did they foresee it as we better prepare as a nation for war at that point?
Not yet.
No.
The First Continental Congress was more of a testing. It was more of a let's look at what is. Let's voice our concerns and see what's going on, and it's still localized. As I said, it's local patriots saying, let's reorganize, let's pull out the old uniforms, pull out the, dust off the muskets, let's start to do some more drill. As I said, Williamsburg and outlying areas, you've got Philadelphia, New York, you've got the beginnings of preparation going on, but Congress isn't really a national authority.
Okay, yeah.
We hadn't. That's many years in the future still. So it's still very localized, and it's still a Massachusetts crisis. Yeah.
So this crisis is really the, if you will, the old cliche, the powder keg.
Yeah.
Here, and we're just we get up to April 18th, and of course the big battle of Lexington and Concord is on April 19th, and so that's the spark.
That is the spark.
It will be the first battle of what we call the American Revolution.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, before we close, it's now time for what we normally call Whoa Trivia, but with the Revolutionary War as our topic, we call it Huzzah Trivia. So, Joe, do you have a piece of significant trivia that you can share with us about this time in our history?
Sure thing. Well, of the 13 colonies that will form the United States, they're not all quite there yet. All but one had mandatory militia service.
Interesting. And so, which is the one?
Which is the one? Well, if you think about it, you have to sort of think about, well, it wasn't Massachusetts, right?
Right.
Well, could it have been New York? No. It was the place with the Quaker tradition. Pennsylvania.
Oh.
Although they had they had their associators. They did not have a mandatory militia.
Oh, okay. Interesting. So it was volunteer militia, not a mandatory
volunteer.
So they still had a militia, though. But
They had a militia law because the militia is a law.
Okay.
It is a constitutional requirement, but they did not have a mandatory structure.
One piece of trivia, because you've kind of alluded to this already, not alluded, you've talked about it a little bit, about all the National Guard units that still have direct lineage to the Revolutionary War. We've got, in the total Army, there are 34 units that have direct lineage to the Revolutionary War. With 33 of those 34 are in the National Guard.
That's right. Only one is in the regular Army.
And which one is that one?
That's the 1st Battalion, 5th Field Artillery Regiment. Very proud because at one point Alexander Hamilton commanded. Right. And we love Alexander Hamilton. And but all the rest are in the National Guard.
Yeah. And those units are mainly spread out on the eastern seaboard, I believe.
Well, yeah, because they're from the they're from.
Yeah, they weren't reflagged or something.
No, we don't do. Yeah, we don't do that in the Guard. So that the other interesting thing about them is that they have been drilling ever since.
Yeah.
So when you say a National Guard unit like the 1st, the 182nd Infantry Regiment in Massachusetts, or the 1st, the 101st Field Artillery Regiment, when you talk about consistency, they have been drilling ever since.
Wow.
And Virginia has the famed 1st, the 116th Infantry. South Carolina, the 263rd Air Defense Artillery. The list goes on, and it's an amazing tradition of readiness.
Great. Well, thank you, Joe, so much for your insights today about the events that led up to the start of the American Revolution. And if anybody wants to learn more about the American Revolution or learn more about Army history in general, then I encourage you to explore our website at history.army.mil. And we have a special website dedicated just to the Revolutionary War, so make sure you check that out. It's a tile on our main website. We also have new publications that are available all about the Revolutionary War. Short publications, I call them pamphlets. I think they're called monographs also. And the first one in that series covers all the information that we've talked about in this podcast. So check that one out. That's called Opening Shots. And if you want to experience Army history every day, then visit us on our social media sites on Facebook, Twitter X, and Instagram. So thanks for joining us today on the United States Army History and Heritage Podcast. For the Center of Military History, I'm Lee Reynolds. And until next time, we're history.
The views expressed in this podcast reflect those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views, policies, or opinions of the U.S. Army or Department of Defense. For more information about the Army's proud history and heritage, go to history.army.mil.